Moahan realized the essential connection between an expanding industry and an expanding foreign policy. He said,
"Whether they will or no, Americans must now begin to look outward. The growing production of the country demands it."
The truth was that America was in desperate need for world markets. Recovering from a depression and with country areas still locked in poverty, it was producing more goods than it could sell at home. And there was another reason for expansion. Uncle Sam's Americans had colonized their own country from coast to coast. Now they needed more room. Some said it was the United States' manifest destiny to expand abroad. Sagamore Hill, Long Island, the family home of Teddy Roosevelt. At the beginning of 1898, he was Assistant Secretary to the Navy, not a figure of power. But his expansionist ideals and determination were to propel him towards higher things. For now, in his book, The Winning of the West, he romanticized the early white settlers and justified the war to come.
It matters little what happens to backward people, because their conquest is in the interests of mankind. It is indeed a warped and silly morality which would forbid a course of conquest that has turned whole continents into the seats of mighty and civilized nations.
William Randolph Hearst was Teddy Roosevelt's lifelong rival. He was larger than life, as tabloid as the headlines in his own papers. His father had been an illiterate miner who became a millionaire. He sent his son to Harvard, where the young Hearst first met TR, and shared with him an intense patriotism, Americanism, he called it. By now, Hearst, still only 35, owned and edited the best-selling papers on the East Coast. He had a lot of flair and few scruples. In January 1897, he sent the famous artist Frederick Remington to Havana to paint the Cuban-Spanish War. Remington reported he could not find any fighting. Hearst wired back, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." It was classic yellow journalism.
Yellow originally came from a cartoon or comic strip that he ran with a character who was dressed in yellow. That's where the term came from, but it began to denote something other than that. It began to denote a sensationalism, big headlines. Hearst was the man who took yellow journalism as far as it would go. And his headlines were bigger and bolder, his illustrations bigger, his prose a little bit more purpler in his paper. And he won the readers.
Hearst's readers wanted war, so his aim was to use his papers to pressurize the government. His great scoop was the Evangelina Cisneros story. He picked up from a small article in a rival newspaper that this attractive young woman was imprisoned in Havana for protesting about the treatment of her father. For Hearst, it was the opportunity for headlines. He launched a campaign for her release. He got his readers to petition the Spanish government. When this had no effect, he sent a reporter, Carl Decker, to Havana to bribe her way out of jail. Apparently disguised as a man, she was smuggled to New York. The Journal trumpeted its success with highly imaginative pictures, and Hearst arranged a heroine's welcome.
He paraded her through the streets. He put her up at the Waldorf Astoria. He had a rally at Madison Square Garden to greet her. He escorted her to Washington to meet with President Kinley. Quickly, the story became not one about this poor woman who had been imprisoned, but about brave William Randolph Hearst and his reporters who had rescued her.
Hearst also would go to Cuba as a correspondent for his own paper, The Journal. While his rival TR marched in with the men, Hearst stayed on his luxury yacht with its own darkroom for developing photographs of the fighting. The real agitators for another war against Spain in Cuba were the Cuban exiles in America. Their first landfall was Key West, just 90 miles from their homeland. The early refugees had settled here, but their hearts were still in Cuba. war against Spain had turned a vague sense of national identity into a deep and ardent national consciousness. Since 1871, the spiritual center of it abroad had been the San Carlos Institute. Here, as much today as 100 years ago, Cuban exiles can preserve their language and traditions. Here was one of America's first bilingual schools, as well as a base for the fight in exile for Cuban independence. During this period, a remarkable Cuban poet, revolutionary, and visionary often visited. His name was José Marti.
Marti was a man who knew no limits as far as what his love for his country was. I think if one word could define Marti, is a man who thought of himself last and of his country first. In his personal life, in his academic and professional life, he gave everything he had for his country. And finally, he gave his life for his country. But in the process, he inspired a nation.
He was born in this house in Havana in 1853. His parents were Spanish, yet from a very early age he was consumed with the idea of an independent Cuba. In fact, the Spanish imprisoned him when he was only 16 for his anti-colonial statements. His health never recovered. He had been crippled by his leg irons, and malnutrition had left him half blind. A quarter of a century later, he was living in New York and writing for the Cuban paper Patria. In 1892, he founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party, establishing branches in many American cities. One of these was at Key West. "200 miles away was the new tobacco town of Ybor City, just outside Tampa. Tobacco made Tampa wealthy until the 1930s, and it still takes pride in its reputation. It was here that Marti made many famous speeches calling for a revolution and for American help in bringing it about.
El líder para que Cuba sea un país libre. That was what the cigar maker said. This is the leader that's going to make Cuba free. And he would frequent the cigar factories. When he would enter the cigar factories, the lectores, that is to say the readers in the cigar factory, would let José Martí come up to his pulpit and speak to the workers. And the cigar makers would all be emotional with the great speeches that he would give, and they would applaud. They would not applaud normally as we would applaud, but they would get their chavetas, which is the cutting blade. Imagine 500 workers in one whole room, all applauding, a tremendous sound that would radiate to the entire neighborhood.
The Havana cigar, the jewel of the smoking world, grown in Cuba, made in Tampa. The cigar label, the ornament on the box, and the weapon of propaganda. The cigar workers came from Cuba and were dedicated to overthrowing Spanish rule. Tampa was a hotbed of revolution. Some agreed with Marti that Cuba's dawn should rise over an independent island. To change masters is not to be free, he said. Others dreamt that peace and justice would come through annexation to the United States, e pluribus unum. Cuban tobacco was worth many millions of dollars to America, so the workers were a powerful lobby. Their mutual aid societies were a forerunner of the trade unions. They became increasingly militant. Their call to arms was heard wherever cigars were smoked. Another weapon, literally, was smuggling guns into Cuba. The American government's position on the Cuban revolt was neutrality. It tried to stop these expeditions, but often failed. Augusto Serrondo remembered leaving his home in America and joining one such raiding party across the narrow strip of sea from Florida.
On the 18th, we went on an expedition from Jacksonville. It took 3 days. And when we got to Camagüey, we were going to land at a place called La Guanaja. But then a warship from Nevitas noticed us, and Emilio Núñez, the chief of the expedition, who had a pair of binoculars, told the captain of our boat that we had better get out of there quickly. There were 21 of us on board a little tugboat, and the warship was huge. We went between the keys, and finally landed in Punta Gorda, Manatí, and went to the province of Camagüey. There, we were split up and put into different military groups.
By early 1895, Marti was ready. The American government was still neutral, but public opinion was supportive. It was fitting that the actual signal for revolt was given in a cigar.
In the final days in New York, Marti signed the Order of Uprising in late January of 1895, gave it to his trusted secretary, Gonzalo de Quesada, with instructions, bring it to West Tampa. In West Tampa, it was taken to the Fernandez O'Halloran factory. There, it was rolled into a cigar. 3 additional cigars were made, and they were transported from Tampa to Key West, from Key West to Havana, and taken to Juan Gualberto Gomez, who cut the cigar and unfolded it and found the Order of Uprising, and it started, the war started, on the 24th of February, 1895, which is called the Marti War of Independence of 95.
In April, Marti landed on a small beach on the east coast of Cuba, just before he had published his manifesto for the revolution.
The war is not against the Spaniard, but against the greed and incompetence of Spain, against the rotten and parochial attitude of her monarchy, and against her inert and vicious meanness. Which fate would the Spaniards choose? War without respite, or lasting peace, which will never be achieved in Cuba without independence?
This monument marks the spot where Marti came ashore. The revolution had begun. After only a few months of fighting, General Maceo and his rebel army were fast approaching the gates of Havana, and it seemed as if Cuban society was splitting apart. On one side were the Spanish-born Peninsulares, who dominated the army, bureaucracy, and trade. They saw any change to the power of Spain as bordering on revolution. On the other side were the native-born Cubans of Spanish descent, called Creoles. They now wanted complete independence for their island. Many of them were secret members of Marti's Cuban Revolutionary Party. Then there was a third group, the blacks who had been slaves until very recently. They had nothing to lose by revolt and responded eagerly to Marti's promise of independence. In fact, fully 60% of the rebel army was black. The streets of Havana were busy. Life looked normal, but the Spanish rulers were close to panic. They knew the city's fall would mean the end of a 400-year-old empire. The Capitan General's palace in Havana was the symbol of Spanish power. Since the days of Christopher Columbus, Spain had regarded the New World, as Europeans called the Americas, as her empire. The Capitan General at this time was Arsenio Martinez Campos, the most prestigious general in the Spanish army and the hero of the previous Cuban War. As Spain was 3 sailing weeks away, he held complete day-to-day control, both as chief minister and head of the army. He lived in grandeur, and his power was always backed up by force. At any one time, Spain kept a standing army of 40,000 men on Cuba. When war was declared, another 200,000 soldiers were dispatched from Spain. Cuba was to be defended to the last peseta, the last drop of blood. Nearly all of Spain's New World Empire had been lost in the first half of the 19th century. In the 1820s, Spain's colonies in Latin America from Venezuela down to Argentina had won their independence. So too had Mexico, and on mainland America, new states had joined the Union from Texas to Nevada. By the 1890s, all that remained of the old New World Empire were Cuba and Puerto Rico. In Asia, Spain clung on to the Philippines. And now these final remnants of greatness were threatened. In America, members of the provisional government of the Cuban Republic, known as the Cuban Junta, were stirring up American opinion to the point of demanding intervention. From offices in New York and Washington, they lobbied anybody who would listen about Cuba Libre. They raised money through war bonds. It seemed to work. In America, the popular image of the revolt was of oppressed fighters for freedom taking on an evil empire, just like the heroes of the American Revolution over 100 years earlier. A favorite argument of those who believed in American conquest was the behavior of the other great powers. Britain, France, and Germany were dividing the cake of empire, so why shouldn't Uncle Sam gobble up Cuba? In 1895, Uncle Sam's telescope was trained on the island. Cuba was important to America's trade. It was suffering under the hands of the Spanish oppressor. It could use a dose of American civilization, and America could use its wealth. Today, the port of Havana is still the busiest in the Caribbean, the gateway to a major city. 150 years ago, with a population of 250,000, Havana was the richest city in the Spanish Empire and, because of its geographic position, the center of trade between the Old World and the New. Nearly 2,000 ships came and went from this port every year. For Spain, Cuba was the pearl of the Antilles, more an overseas province than a colony. Most of its population came from Spain. Nearly 750,000 Spaniards migrated to Cuba in the last 3 decades of the 19th century, and family links remained strong.